Hi everyone, my name's Eagle. I'm the publisher at No Earth Comics. And we're starting a new series today, and it's going to be called Character Studies. And the reason for this is real simple. When I'm asked what type of stories we're looking for, I always say the same thing. We're looking for compelling stories, we're looking for compelling characters, and we're looking for stories that fit within the No Earth universe. And one of the things that constantly gets asked is what makes a story compelling and what makes a character compelling. So this particular series is going to be geared towards trying to answer the question of what makes a character compelling. And what we're going to do is in each episode we're going to break down a particular character and see if we can identify what makes this character compelling and what makes this character a good comic book character. And today we're going to start with my longtime favorite character, Barbara Gordon. And she's no longer my favorite character, but we'll get into why during the course of the video. So the thing to keep in mind here is that we're not trying to break down the history of the character, and she's had some controversies, and some of those controversies are ongoing, and we're not going to try and break those down either. What we're going to do is try and identify what makes this character compelling, what makes this character cool. So we're going to start with the fact that Barbara Gordon was created and released in January of '67. It actually wound up being December of '66 because comic books are usually released ahead of their date. But so she's been around for 50 years. And she was released as pretty much a fully formed character, even though she was introduced into the canon as what was going to be a supporting character. The first story, Batgirl's $1 Million debut, was actually very, very Barbara Gordon-centric. So we got to see a lot of the character. This is back in the days of thought balloons, so we got to see a lot of her internal process. And this is part of an introduction process that provides us with a good insight into the character. Unlike most female characters that share a name with a male character, Barbara Gordon was not introduced as a girlfriend or as a wife or a sister of Batman. She was introduced as an independent character who was not even connected to Batman except through the tenuous connection of being Commissioner Gordon's adopted daughter. So right off the bat, we have something that's a little bit different. The next thing is that Barbara Gordon's origin is not rooted in tragedy. She's on her way to a costume party where she's basically dressing up as a female version of Batman. And she happens onto a crime. But on her way to the costume party, we are introduced to who she is. And she specifically states that she's already graduated from Gotham State University with a PhD, cum laude. She's already a brown belt in judo. She's not been preparing for a life of crime fighting except inadvertently. Now, her father's a cop. In fact, her father's the top cop in Gotham. But she is not the typical superhero. She comes to this honestly. She doesn't suffer a childhood tragedy and spend her life trying to avenge something. She, unlike Batman and Robin, what she is a person who simply happens to have the skills, or part of the skills, to be a crime fighter. So she winds up inadvertently falling into the role of a superhero and enjoys it. She is not the driven, psychosis-ridden character that we see all too often. And this makes her different. This makes her compelling. This makes her unusual. She's a professional woman. In fact, Barbara Gordon was a feminist icon before feminist icons became a thing. In the YouTube channel, I will link to the 1972 PSA video that Yvonne Craig did as Batgirl for the 72 Fair Pay Act. And it's a cute little video, but it's showing that Barbara Gordon / Batgirl has been a feminist from the get-go. Now, originally when the character's introduced, her secret identity, Barbara Gordon, is a mousy librarian. Well, that lasted all of about 3 or 4 appearances, and then she started becoming more vibrant, more active, and more... she started becoming a stronger female character in her secret identity as well as in her costumed identity. She's never been one to depend on male characters, and so she's done fine as a solo character. And here's where we run into some interesting things. Barbara Gordon is she's a character that never quite worked as Batgirl. And a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but the fact is, the sales were never there. The fan base was there because I was a huge fan of Barbara Gordon, Batgirl. I was a huge fan of the Batman TV show. Hey guys, I'm old enough to have watched that first run. Okay, I watched it back when it was showing every Tuesday and Thursday, and I watched it religiously. And I read the comics, and I'm a geek and a nerd all the way through. So this was part of my formative experiences growing up, because I hadn't even hit teenagerhood yet. I wasn't attracted to Barbara Gordon because Yvonne Craig looked damn good in a suit. I was attracted to Barbara Gordon as a character because she was doing this regardless of whether or not Batman and Robin wanted her to do this. She was much more identifiable for me than either Batman or Robin. And this included the comic books and the live-action TV show. So I had a lot more fun with her. Plus, the fact is, throughout school, I was usually working in the library, so having a librarian be a superhero just really appealed to me. The thing to remember here is that this was not the standard for introducing a superhero. Now, there's all sorts of behind-the-scenes stories, some of them conflicting as to why Batgirl came about. There had been an earlier incarnation of Batgirl that was Kathy Keene's niece, and she was introduced to be a sort of date material for Robin because Wortham, hereafter known as He Whose Name Shall Not Be Mentioned, in his book Seduction of the Innocents had implied, no, he had flat out stated that Batman and Robin were homosexual. And so Batwoman and Batgirl were introduced in an effort to put this aside. We'll discuss the irony of making the modern incarnation of Batwoman lesbian later. But for now, so Barbara Gordon is not dependent on Batman. She's not dependent on Robin. She's not a sidekick. She is her own hero, and she is from the word go. So this makes her different. She is independent of Batman, and this makes her different. They don't know who she is. This is kind of cool. So she's not she doesn't fall into the typical female version of a male character. In fact, she's not a female version of the male character. She is not She-Hulk, she's not Spider-Woman, she's not Supergirl. She is Batgirl, and she is distinctly different than Batman. Her methods are different. Her abilities are different. She is, from the very beginning, based on knowledge. She's a librarian. It's not established at first, but it quickly becomes apparent that she has an eidetic memory, photographic memory for those of you who are not hitting the dictionary. But she has an eidetic memory, and this is later, in later comics, this is used almost as a superpower, a la, I forget what the name of the TV show was that had a person who had perfect recall. But the concept of this crime-fighting librarian was unusual. It still is. So, flash forward to 1988. And in 1988, Batgirl has been tried in a number of different books. She headlined the Batman family for a while. The sales on it and the sales on Detective Comics were poor enough that they wound up combining the two comics in an effort to try and save both of them. And she, by this point in time, has risen to the ranks of the Justice League of America. She is pretty much familiar with the entire DC universe. She has become a congresswoman, a two-term congresswoman from Gotham. So a good portion of her adventures are set in DC. She teams up with Superman several times in DC in sort of a World's Finest type arrangement. Also, she teams up with Supergirl in a sort of World's Finest type of arrangement. If I recall correctly, she even dated Jimmy Olsen for a little bit. Her usual love interest was Jason Bard, and Google him if you want some fun. But by 1988, she had already retired as Batgirl. There had already been a Batgirl special #1 that contained a story called Batgirl's Last Case. And in 1988, The Killing Joke came out. And we're not going to go into the controversy on Batgirl's treatment in The Killing Joke, other than for me to say that as a writer, the concept of using supporting characters to raise the stakes for the main character in the story is a perfectly acceptable concept. And people constantly complain about Barbara Gordon's treatment during The Killing Joke, and what they're not realizing is it's not a Batgirl story. Batgirl is a minor supporting character, or actually Barbara Gordon, because Batgirl is no more by the time of The Killing Joke. Okay? Barbara Gordon is a minor supporting character within The Killing Joke, and she is there to raise the stakes. And there's a lot of comments back and forth about whether or not this is an acceptable practice when it's a female character raising the stakes for a male character. And what I'm going to say is that part of this is due to the fact that we have an imbalance of male and female characters in comics. That balance is changing. But we do not have gender parity in comics, so naturally we're going to see far more instances of a female loved one being damaged to motivate a male character than we're going to see a male character being damaged to motivate a female character. But I can show you lots of examples of a male character undergoing this type of trauma to motivate a female character. But be that as it may, The Killing Joke left Barbara Gordon paralyzed from the waist down. She had been shot in the abdomen. She had been stripped and photographed. And this was a traumatic experience. So in '89, she shows up a year later, she shows up again, and she shows up in Suicide Squad of all places. And we don't know it's her. We just know that it's a new character named Oracle. We don't know who Oracle is. But over the next 2 years, there's some subtle clues dropped, and finally it's revealed to be Barbara Gordon in a wheelchair, and she's now Oracle. So what we've done is we've taken a character that was basically discarded by DC, and we've turned her into something new and different. And over the next decade and a half, we wind up going from, over the next 2 decades, because this goes until 2011. We wind up going from Barbara Gordon being a cripple in a wheelchair, being paralyzed in a wheelchair, to being a poster child for disabled people. And this is pretty amazing in the first place, because comic books haven't really delved into disabilities. Yes, we've got Daredevil with his blindness, we've got Professor X sitting in a wheelchair, but in most cases they have abilities that compensate for their disability. Donald Blake, he's lame, but he can strike his cane on the ground and turn into Thor. Barbara Gordon becomes the first one who doesn't have a superpower to offset her disability. Let that sink in a second. She becomes the first mainstream comic book character who uses her disability not as a crutch, not as a bully pulpit, but it simply is part of who she is. Then she takes the thing that has always been the most amazing about her, which is her mind and her desire to help. She is a superhero not because of tragedy, but because this is something she enjoys doing, and she enjoys helping people. And she takes her librarian skills and her knowledge and her analytical mind and turns herself into DC's information broker. And so we wind up with Oracle being Batman's primary source of information, being the Justice League of America's primary source of information. She winds up becoming one of the most important characters in the entire DC universe because of her mind, and there's no superpowers involved. So again, she becomes an even more amazing character. Then, by this point in time, in comic book canon, she's in her mid to late 30s. She's had an exciting career. I mean, she's already in her mid-20s when she debuts. So this is roughly 10 years later. Comic books move slow. Get used to it. So she winds up being this highly important part of the DC universe. Ex-Congresswoman, head of the Gotham Library system. Now she is the information broker to the superhero community. And without her, the DC universe is a much poorer place. Then she takes all of her years of skill and experience and puts that to use, and she starts the Birds of Prey, which is a female-centric superhero group that's designed to work in an almost espionage fashion and provide help where it's needed the most. So she winds up mentoring up-and-coming superheroes. She even mentors the second Batgirl Cassandra Cain. She mentors the third Batgirl, Stephanie Brown. She turns from a former disabled superhero into a mentor, into a team leader, into an organizer, passing her skills, her experience on to the next generation. This is a fantastic character arc. This is something that makes a compelling character because she starts not out of tragedy, but out of the absolute altruistic desire to help people, and moves into each phase of her career with that same attitude. There's never a change in the core character from when she was first introduced. This is a fantastic character arc. This is a compelling character. This is somebody that can be identified with no matter what your background. You can identify with who Barbara Gordon is and what she's accomplishing. This makes for a good story because once you have the compelling character, the stories come easier. And any reasonable writer can write a good Barbara Gordon story from whatever period of her career. I mean, think about it. You've got a superhero who's a congresswoman, sitting congresswoman. How many good stories can you write off of that, especially when she's a street-level superhero? The way that this character developed and the way that this character evolved is the hallmark of a good comic book character. And from 66 or 67 until 2011, her development, her evolution was fantastic. We're going to gloss over what's happened since 2011 by simply saying that they have reverted her to being pretty much a teeny bopper back at college. The woman has 2 PhDs, but they have retconned or ignored her entire history in an effort to make her more appealing to young people, even though there have been 2 people in that costume since her that ran perfectly good comic book runs as that character. But having Barbara Gordon back in the Batgirl suit was somehow important. Now, the Barbara Gordon character, in addition to being one of the main characters on the 3rd season of the Batman TV series, also did, I believe, 16 episodes of Birds of Prey back in the early 2000s, which was actually a very good show. If you haven't seen it, find a copy of it. It's worth watching, especially since they used the Earth 2 version of Huntress, which is the daughter of Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle. It's a fun little show. But the main thing about that show was the very mature portrayal of Barbara Gordon as Oracle and the flashbacks to her as Batgirl and the poignancy of her missing the action of being in the suit. So, as a character and as a character arc, the point from Barbara Gordon's introduction as the $1 million debut of Batgirl all the way to her last stories as Oracle is an example of how to create a compelling character. This character appeals to everybody based on a number of different criteria. Number one, overcoming adversity, overcoming disabling things both emotionally, mentally, and physically, overcoming oppression in the fact that she starts out as a female trying to make it in a world where men are likely to pat her on the head and tell her, "Now, little lady, don't go doing anything dangerous," and a number of scenes in the early comics deal with this, including patronizing attitudes from Batman and Robin. She quickly proves herself to be a competent crime fighter. And she's never a sidekick. She's never an afterthought. She's never... In Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, Batman refers to Two-Face calling Robin the boy hostage. And Batgirl was never the hostage to be rescued. Even in The Killing Joke, where, as has been pointed out, all of her agency is removed, she's not a weak character. Even as a 10 panels, maybe, I'd have to go back and count, but she doesn't appear in very many panels in the book at all. She is an afterthought in the book because she's there to raise the stakes. But even there, she's not displayed as the typical simpering, hapless female that so many comic books have been guilty of doing. She's been a strong character the entire time. And even though it was horrible what happened to her, the next story arc we see of her is her overcoming this. Now, there's a bunch of stories floating around on the internet about the behind-the-scenes machinations required to bring her back. And that's cool. What I'm referring to here today is not the behind-the-scenes controversies. What I'm referring here today is the on-page progression of the character. So that's going to be our first episode. And if you've got comments, feel free to leave them. This is one of my favorite topics. I'll be happy to respond to them. But in the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and I'll be talking to you again.